Morning, everyone. Uh, this is the first time I'm doing it. Okay, and wildlife photography has been a passion, and over the last few years, I've been going out with Naresh and doing wildlife photography. And I thought it's a good session to share some of our things that we have learned over the last 10, 12 years. I started doing. I'm a hobbyist wildlife photographer. I'm not a professional wildlife photographer. I've been what do you call? 12 years back, I accidentally started wildlife photography. I'll come to it, but uh, wildlife is more of a passion than wildlife photography. I mean, I love being in the nature. I love, being in the forest, seeing the wildlife activity, and sometimes it's not even forest, just the things around locally as well. Uh, on the other side, in between weekends when I'm not doing wildlife, I work as head of marketing for a small IT services firm. I mean, a very nice firm, and I love to travel. That's me. I'll let Naresh introduce himself.
So before I introduce about me a little bit more, I want to take a step back and say, acknowledge the reason why I'm standing here, right? It's all because of this guy, right? If I haven't met him at all in the past, probably I wouldn't have held a camera, or probably I wouldn't have known what is wildlife or anything of that sort. So thanks for introducing me into this whole wildlife adventure. The first experience of mine was I borrowed his camera and his equipment. Out of sheer impulse, me and Maya just went to Masai Mara. And from the time I came back, I'm like, okay, fine, I'm going to invest in buying the equipment, and I'm going to invest my time in doing this. I also have enrolled or go around with a renowned wildlife photographer called Philip Ross, and he's I can say he's one of my mentors, apart from this guy. So that's about me. And this photo is from our recent trip to Dandeli, and thanks to Prakriti, she could capture two nutcases photographing some hornbills.
So what's the agenda for today? The agenda is not to delve too much. I mean, try to bring out some of the nuances of wildlife photography, understand what is wildlife photography, a little bit of understanding on the equipment and the technology and things like that, which Naresh will capture. And we'll take some questions on what are the good things to do, what you have any questions about wildlife photography, if you start off, what do you need, and things like that. So what is wildlife photography? Can anybody answer that? Anyone? So wildlife photography is a genre of photography where you document wildlife in its natural habitat. So basically it could be anything. It need not be elephants or tigers and leopards. It could be any kind of wildlife. It's one of the most challenging forms of photography, and it requires a lot of knowledge of the equipment, of the photographic skills and things like that. But in addition, you also need to understand a lot of softer nuances as well, which is more important. What I feel, I mean, over the last 12 years, it's not about the technological aspects of it. It's the softer nuances that make you a better wildlife photographer, and that's what I'll be covering. Can anybody guess what this is?
It's an eye of something.
What?
Is it a snake? It's an eye of something. I know that. Is it a snake?
No, it's a toad. It's the common Indian toad. That's a toad. So the reason why I put this photo is I wanted to say that wildlife photography is not just shooting tigers or leopards or black panthers, which has now become a craze everywhere. It's about shooting smaller things as well. So there are different forms of wildlife photography. You could be shooting birds, animals, and reptiles. You could be doing macro. This is a macro shot actually, where you could be using a different kind of lens to shoot a very specific small things. You could also be doing a lot of landscape photography as well. And you can also do marine or underwater photography. I mean, I have not done marine or underwater photography at this point of time, but you have.
Is that a photograph of you?
Yeah, that's me. That's me in the, which you can see in the.
That's a selfie. Does it count as a selfie?
This counts as a selfie actually. So sorry. So these are the different types of wildlife photography that you typically do, and for each one of them you might need different kind of equipments, which Naresh is going to cover. But it's not just about shooting the big four as they call it, but it's also about doing a lot more with photography, and that's what I wanted to cover actually at this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover some of the nuances of wildlife photography. You might call it the softer side of it, not the technical aspects of it. Because what I've felt or what I've been trained, mentored by my mentors is that it's not about the equipment, it's about the wildlife. So I'm going to talk about those things. First of all, I mean, whatever anybody says or whatever you read about wildlife photography, saying this is the equipment, this is the technology, this is the skill and things like that, you gotta love wildlife if you want to shoot wildlife photography. I mean, that's what I've always believed in, that's what I've been taught. This is the first photograph of a bird I ever took. I mean, before this I'd never shot a bird or anything. I mean, I used to love to go to the forest, being brought up in a city like Mysore where you are 2 hours away from a forest. When you bunk college, the next thing that you do is actually go on a trip to Bandipur, Nagarhole, BR Hills or Ooty. So you always end up in the forest. So I used to love, but this was 12 years back when I started. This was not even my camera. I mean, I bought a camera for my wife because she wanted a DSLR. I had broken my leg, and I used to beg people to take me to go into outside the house. I mean, I was inside the house for 6 months, not traveling. So I used to ask people if you can just drive me up the Madhumalai Ghats and bring me down. And one of our trips to Ooty, we were sitting outside a shop, and she went shopping, and I shot this. And when I saw this bird, I fell in love with that bird. And that's where my journey started. And you need to fall in love with wildlife if you want to do wildlife photography. I mean, I've seen a lot of my friends who bought equipment because I was doing equipment, but over a period of time they sold it and they moved on to the next hobby in life. So it's all about loving it. And once I found this, I wanted to know what that bird was. So then you started searching, then you ended up on India Nature Watch, which was a big craze at that point of time. You learned then you were like fascinated by, wow, there's so much of wildlife out there. You wanted to shoot tigers, you saw photos, you saw videos, and you were like, wow, you can do this as well. And that's how wildlife started for me. And then you also met quite a few people. I mean, one person whom I should credit was Karthikeyan, who was here last week, who changed my perspective about wildlife photography, about the ethics in wildlife photography, of how you can do a lot more with wildlife photography and enjoy it more by not just concentrating on what I call as the big four and just running behind them. And that's what I say. I mean, you gotta love them if you want to actually do wildlife photography, and that's the point I want to make. You had a question.
Which bird is it?
That's a crimson-backed sunbird found in the Western Ghats. One of the first things that you need to do when you do wildlife photography is know your subject. You need to understand what an animal does, its food habits, the way it flies or the way it runs, what it does. It's not about understanding just shooting, understanding your camera skills. It's also understanding the wildlife, because I think that's more important than understanding your camera skills. For example, I mean, we were in a boat safari on Ranganthittu, and we saw this going to the water, and we knew that when it comes out, it might come out with something. So you waited for it, and you actually, we got this shot. So it's about understanding what it does. Similarly, we have done, I've shot a lot of photos where I know when a shikra flies, I know how it will actually go around in a circle, and I'm waiting for it to come back. Or if there's a black-shouldered kite, I know what it does. Thanks to Chayant, now I understand how vipers curl up when they are in a thing, so you know what to shoot for, what to wait for. So you need to understand their habitats, understand their food habits, and try to, anticipate that movement. It's also about knowing your location. Sometimes knowing your location can help you actually frame the subject in the way you want it. It could be anywhere. I mean, one of the advantages that I've had over the last 12 years is I've been traveling to some of these places very frequently. So you know what happens at these places. This photo was of a female we shot in Kabini. There's a famous lake in Kabini called the Tiger Tank. If you have ever been to Nagarhole, the Kabini side of the Nagarhole forest. And when we were there, we heard this alarm call, and we were very sure, knowing the location, where it was going and where it will come out. So you actually need to know your location, and that's where it helps, where you frequent some of the places. I mean, I'm pretty sure you ask Sandeep and he'll cover it today evening when he talks about Dodbele Lake. He knows what happens over there. So you need to know your locations. I'm not saying that's a very important factor, but it helps you a lot in photography. And try local places. I mean, wildlife photography is not about going to exotic places. It's also about doing wildlife in your local areas. I mean, some of the most fascinating wildlife stories that I have are from Bangalore, where I've gone out with a group of people. I mean, for all of you who don't know, there is this group called BNG Birds in Bangalore, which does weekend birding. There are some amazing people over there. I mean, one of the people whom I know is called Deepa Mohan. If you are interested in going birding out, you should actually reach out to her on Facebook, and she does amazing things. And the kind of things you learn from all these groups is very nice. And this actually is from Gudas Malhar. I mean, this is one of my favorite photos, and this is actually on the Malhar Avenue. And this is, you need to try your local places. I mean, Sandeep is going to talk about it in the evening about local places and how he did 100 birds in 9 months, and that's a fascinating thing. So you need to understand that it's not about going to far off places like Corbett or Ranthambore. It's about trying local places as well for wildlife photography. I mean, there are some nearby places as well which are very good, like Kokrebellur, which is famous for its pelicanary, or if you travel to Ramnagar has the vulture sanctuary, or Rangantittu is amazing. I mean, I spent weekends just going to Rangantittu, spending the whole day and coming back. I mean, and even if you start traveling, right, I mean, local places which are quite nearby, like BR Hills, Nagarhole, Bandipur, which are very, you don't have to go a long distance to do wildlife photography. I mean, Bangalore that way is blessed. It has got a lot of places to do wildlife photography. One of the important aspects is you need to allow adequate time and anticipate the perfect moment. When you are in the wild, it's not like a movie where you go, things will happen. You actually need to have patience. One of the biggest things wildlife photography has taught me is actually being patient in life. I mean, I'm somebody who wants to get things done. I'm known for it at work. But when I head out into the forest or when I head out birding, it changes completely because I try to wait for the bird. I mean, for example, we were in Kaziranga and we were seeing these two red-breasted parakeets playing around, and then the naturalist with me was explaining how actually as part of the courtship ritual it actually feed it. So we waited almost half an hour over there when we could get this shot. So it's about waiting for that perfect moment. Be patient. I mean, things take a long time in wildlife. It's not something that you say I go there and it happens. I mean, I've seen that we have been in the forests of any of the forests, right? I mean, you get people who are like, I don't see anything. I mean, people expect it to be like Bannerghatta Zoo Safari where you go and you see everything and you come out. It's not like that. I mean, you have to wait. I mean, there have been days where you have gone, sat for 2 hours, 3 hours, and you don't see anything and you come out. But you enjoy the forest. I mean, you can ask others at the back. You would have spent days together trying to video something, and it would take months together, right? I mean, and it's not about going in there and getting it out. You have to give that adequate time to enjoy wildlife photography, actually. And be ready for that special moment. I mean, this is my most favorite photograph. I mean, this was shot in Khana. This was on the first day of the 5-day trip. We were there and we saw one of the parent, which is in the end, fly into the nest. And we went there. I was able to get on top of the jeep and take a shot. This was the only shot I could take. And after that, every day, the remaining 8 safaris we have gone there, we will not get it. I mean, and we just got it once, and then the parents took the kids inside, so we could not get a photo at all. I mean, afterwards we saw 1, 2, and things like that, but we could never get that 5 photo owls together. So you always need to be ready for that moment. I mean, when you're on a safari or when you're walking, be ready with your equipment, thinking that the next moment you'll have your best photograph always. And be creative. I mean, you don't need to have sharp photos with nice bouquets and things like that. You can do a lot more. I mean, Naresh is going to talk about some of the things like composition and things like that. You can break all rules and try to be creative. I think one of the aspects of wildlife photography, which a lot of people don't do and try to just shoot, is get that nice sharp photo with a bouquet in the background, and that's what it makes. But you can always be creative, try to play around with the composition, try to play around with your aperture, try to play around with the shutter speed, your exposure, everything. I mean, you can play with everything and be creative with what you're doing. And your pictures need to tell a story. So when you give that time, you will understand how you can tell a story around each photograph. I mean, for example, I don't know if all of you can see. You can see the claws in this. Oh, in this portion, there is a claw actually. So we were in Kaziranga and we were flying, and I saw this parakeets fly, and I just took a shot and we moved on. But actually, when we came back and I was processing it, that was when I realized there was actually a monitor lizard inside the nest eating it. So all your pictures tell a story. So you need to give it time, wait for it, so that you can build a story around it. I mean, end of the day, the whole idea of wildlife photography is you tell a story so that you inspire others to actually take up wildlife photography, which in turn leads to conservation. I mean, what I believe is if you don't love them and you make them get inspired, you'll never have conservation happening. That's how all of us got into it, because you were inspired by a photograph or inspired by seeing something and things like that. And always have your camera with you. I mean, this is our backyard. I mean, in our house, given that we have been shooting for 12 years, I have some old cameras. So the old cameras and the old lenses are always ready. Even when we travel, there is always a camera which I carry to office every day and come back, because you never know what happens on the nice road. So it's always having a camera ready. I mean, I'm not saying you should do it, but always have the camera ready, because you never know when you get a moment. I mean, this is one of those things where in our backyard we actually had the mongoose came hunt for the mouse. And if the camera was not ready, we would have not got this shot. I mean, and thanks to Pranav for this shot actually. I was not at home that day when we shot it. So that's about the softer aspects of it. I'll let Naresh talk about the more serious aspects of it. But if you have any questions, I'm ready to take it. And
more serious and more boring aspect of it. I want to put out a disclaimer over here. There are some experts in the room, so please ignore if it is too naive for you guys, but this is more targeted towards beginners, or what are the first few things that we want to keep in mind if we want to get into wildlife photography and stuff like that. First thing I'm going to talk about is an equipment. You need to do your research before you get your equipment. You need to understand what is frames per second. Do you need 10 frames per second? Do you need 20 frames per second? Frames per second is nothing but how many photos can you take in a second, where the shutter speed and your the shutter itself will help you take those many frames and move on. Megapixels, what's the pros and cons of megapixels? Is a higher megapixel very important, or is a low megapixel is good enough? You need to do your research around it. Autofocus speeds, especially if you want to capture a bird in flight. How good should be your autofocus speeds? What is the combination of lens and the camera that will get you those autofocus speeds? What should be the sensor size? Should you get a crop sensor? Should you get a full frame sensor? A lot of parameters that goes into getting your equipment, but I think I've just put down 4 of them. But overall, the question marks next to them suggest that you need to do your research and you need to understand what you want to get into before you take any recommendations. One of the things that I've also put down there is that you need to talk to friends or mentors if you have. They can help you in guiding you or giving you tips and tricks on what should be the next best equipment. One thing I've personally done is try before you buy. As I said, I tried all this equipment and then I bought my equipment. You can rent. There's a lot of options to rent equipment these days. There's a lot of online sites where you can go register yourself and rent cameras, lens, various types of lenses that I'm going to talk about. But it will be great if you can get hands-on experience, you try it out, you feel comfortable with the equipment, and then move on and go, invest in your own equipment. This is the shot I wanted to say before I move on further, saying you do not always have to have good equipment with you for you to really do capture the moments that you're in. This was one of the night jays that we were walking the other day and we captured. This was actually captured on the phone. Maybe not the best of the clarity and composition and everything else, but at least at that moment in time you had a phone. So you always need to keep in mind saying that even a phone can do the job for you. There are different types of lens. I'm just going to cover these 3, probably the most widely used lens. The telephoto lens is basically for you to get the reach. When your subject is really far and you need the reach, you need to use the telephoto lens. There are various telephoto lenses available, and there are also some prime telephoto lenses that some people over here use, which is really, really helpful when you need to get the whole bokeh and when you need to capture more light. And I'm going to talk about the light and aperture and stuff like that. Macro lens is primarily for close-up shots. Like this is definitely not like a selfie that Vinay took with the Toad, but this is the close-up of a Malabar gliding frog. For things like this and the wine snakes and the night photography for macro, if you want really close-up subjects, macro lens is what you need to use. And then the wide-angle lens when you need to capture the landscape that you're right around. This is something that I've learned from my mentor, and I just wanted to bring it up over here. So, in wildlife photography, the easiest things that you can remember and how you want to remember them, it's something called as a case strategy that my mentor told me. You just need to remember these 4 letters and what they correspond to. And for the ease of remembrance, it's just called the case strategy. The C, the first one in that, is primarily composition. How do you want to compose your subject? The tendency is that if we are beginners and if we want to shoot, our natural tendency is that, okay, I have this focus point in the center, I'm going to put the subject in the center of my frame, I'm just going to take a shot. It's always, that's the immediate reaction that we have. But the thing to remember is something like a rule of third. Try to tell a story, like when I was saying, tell a story, like you want to show the subject, but you don't want the subject in the middle of your frame, but can you show some of the habitat around it? Can you capture it in a way that you have your subject and the habitat around it, right? This is again another one. I could have put the lion in the center and taken a photo, but I'm just giving it more space around it so that it looks a little different. Same thing goes with the vertical also. This is not a very well processed image because there was overcast and everything else, but you could put your subject in the rule of thirds and capture the sky. And if the sky is dramatic, imagine if it is blue or it is raining or it is a sunset, you're just capturing much more than the subject that you're interested in. That's the composition piece, that's the C in the case. The next one is going to be A. A is both autofocus as well as aperture. Without going into being too technical, autofocus is a feature that's available in your camera. You can use it. Recommendation is to see if you can always focus on eye, if you can. And not in all subjects that you can focus on the eye, but focusing on the eye, that brings out that whole catch light effect, right? So in this photo, if you look at the eye, there's a small reflection of the sun or the light. That's called the catch light effect. Aperture is basically the amount of light you're allowing through the lens onto your camera sensor. That defines aperture. So each and every camera, and you have a lens, that lens will have an aperture value. It will change from, like, if it is a telephoto lens 4.5 to 6.3, whatever numbers, or if it is a prime, it will be 2.8 or 4, whatever those numbers are. But the simplest way to remember is lower the number of the aperture, the more light you are sending into your sensor through the lens. That's all you need to remember.
In the autofocus, can you also set an aperture, or autofocus automatically sets the aperture?
Autofocus and aperture are two independent things. So autofocus is basically, it's a camera's ability to point at a subject and focus so that you get your focus speed. Aperture is the next set where after you have focus or you have the subject in clear plane, you're letting the camera know how much light that it needs to capture. Right? So if in the same photograph, let's take the example of the same photograph, this has been shot at the lowest aperture number. That means I've let the maximum light come into the camera. If I had increased the aperture number, you would have started seeing the background, the leaves, the trees, a lot more things. Then you're focusing a very narrower path, and then you're letting lesser light come in, and you're getting more the background.
So would you set these things before? Because when it's in the wild, at that moment, will you have enough time? Will the subject wait?
Absolutely. So I was just going to say that and close this slide saying that two things that you need to keep in mind is you can always set the autofocus and leave it, right? But the focus point in the camera, you can switch around based on the subject. Like for example, in this is my frame. If my focus point was in the center, I would move the focus point to the eye, right? And then I did the autofocus. Aperture is something that I personally always set it to the lowest. I don't need to change it. I wouldn't change it unless and until I'm capturing something else where I need something else in it. But by default, you can set the autofocus and aperture to the lowest and leave it.
So the aperture becomes more you get the wider.
Not the wider thing, but the focus that you're narrowing it down, right? Like in this case, if I set the aperture higher or lower, the frame is only this much. This is what I'm going to capture. But if I'm setting it to the lower number, then my focus is only going to be on the bird or the subject, and I don't want any other thing to distract. What it's called as a bokeh, a Japanese term for blurred out background.
Into the portrait mode.
I'm sorry.
The portrait mode in your phone.
Yeah, portrait mode in your phone. If the new smartphones have the portrait mode, right? When you go to the portrait mode, it automatically starts blurring out the background. It will blur out the background and it will focus only on the face, right? So that's a good point. And if I increase the aperture, I'll be capturing a little bit more beyond the bird itself, the subject itself. I would start seeing it more clearly over there if I want to do it. Sorry, you were saying something?
Basically the depth of field.
Depth of field.
You have to explain that. That's easier to understand.
So in your previous photographs of the elephant and all that, your aperture was larger, so you could get the background. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Shutter speed is the next in the case. We finished C, we finished A, then I'm moving on to S, shutter speed. It is always good to get a minimum shutter speed of 100 per second, especially for wildlife photography. If you're doing portraits and any other kind of photography, it is okay for you to experiment a little bit. But with wildlife photography, you should always try to get 100 per second of your shutter speed. The simple reason being, when you are in the wild and there is an action happening, like for example this bird is flying, it's a very fast action. You need to react quickly, right? If your shutter speeds are slow, A, you will probably not capture that action, and B, even the slightest movement will give you a blur. You will go out of focus. Like for example, you're shooting and your shutter speeds are low, even your breath, your breathing while you are shooting can cause a distortion or a noise or a blur in the thing. So it's always recommended that you have a minimum of a 100 per second, and you can go all the way for 1/800 per second, whatever the shutter speed. The only thing that impacts the shutter speed is, or the biggest factor that impacts the shutter speed is your ISO. When you are in aperture priority mode, you're not probably setting the shutter speed. You're playing around with the amount of light that is going to come in. So, which is, I think I've moved it ahead. So, should I go ahead and come back? Yeah. ISO. I'll go back now that I was talking about ISO. ISO is a term used. It's basically how do you want the sensor on your camera to react to the light and capture the image. That is the setting. It starts all the way from 80, 15 different cameras and goes all the way up to 52,000 or whatever is the ISO setting. But this ISO setting is basically going to tell you or tell the camera how should those pixels on the sensors react to the light that is coming in, right? In this image, this was shot at a very high ISO, right? The reason I shot this at a very high ISO was because of the light conditions. This was early morning, it was very little light, the sun was just about coming out, but I had to get the 100th of the shutter speed, 100th of a second shutter speed, so I had to bump up the ISO. What basically happens is if you bump up the ISO and go higher on the ISO range, you start seeing grains, you start seeing a lot of noise. So lower the ISO, better clarity, but again it depends on the lighting condition. If you have very good lighting conditions, you can keep the ISO very low, and then you can still reach the 100th of a second shutter speed. For the beginners, I recommend there is an auto setting in the ISO. If you can choose the auto setting, it might be a little noisier than you manually controlling the ISO in your camera, but it's always okay if you get that than not get the shot at all and then post-process it later on. Right? So that's ISO, and ISO is very closely related to shutter speed. So ISO defines what kind of a shutter speed you will eventually get based on how much sensitive you're making your sensor.
But so the ISO makes it brighter, or how does it adjust the light? It adjusts the lighting automatically.
Okay, that's a good point. So ISO, aperture, and exposure component, which I'm going to talk about next. These are the three things that basically defines how bright you want your image to be, or how dim you want it. So all three of them play a part in making your image look brighter or not. But they have different effects, right? For your aperture, basically you are saying the same thing. How bright do I want? What I want. But basically you're controlling the depth of field as Deep was mentioning and saying, do I just capture my subject or things around it, behind it, before it, and stuff like that. That's one. So you're letting more light on. ISO is again the same thing. It will make it brighter and or dimmer based on how you're setting it. But ISO is directly dependent on the light conditions that you're shooting in. Right? If you're shooting it in the dark, you would probably need to bump up your ISO because you need to capture it much brighter. And the downside of it is the noise that I was talking about. You'll get a lot of grains. Right?
Just to clarify, it's a thing that we have inherited from the film days. So I used to shoot in film, there used to be ISO, ASA also they call it.
ASA.
ASA 100, ASA 400. There used to be different films with different sensitivity. So when we moved to digital, we just adopted those standards which were set by some international organization which set those standards.
Yeah, there's no true definition of ISO, it's just like a standard that was set.
It's changing so rapidly that the modern cameras are invariable to ISO. They're actually, so each camera will have a different range of ISO which you can shoot in. It's a controversial topic among the
It is.
That's
Especially when you're coming from a film thing to your digital
So
thing.
the new digital cameras, I have a digital camera which is ISO invariable, which means that it doesn't matter. In fact, I get more noise at lower ISO than at higher ISO. So there's a range in which you can shoot. So this is a very controversial topic.
But you need to do
understand it. It actually means the sensitivity of light.
absolutely sensitivity of the light, and you need to play around with it. You need to get your hands on it, and you need to find what is your sweet spot that you like based on your own liking.
So even in the auto, I think there's a range you can set.
Auto, you can set a range for shutter speed.
So even for
ISO.
ISO.
So you can tell the camera don't go beyond
Beyond this.
And minimum and a maximum. You set a bracket saying that okay, this is the bracket you're going to work with. Within this limits, you're going to play around. Exposure component is the last one that I want to talk about. It's the E in your case. This is basically, I use it to be a little bit more creative, like when I was mentioning be creative with your shot. This was actually a proper, day shot, but the light was falling on the subject in such a way that it was almost giving a rim light effect. So I really reduced the exposure component and try to get this just the silhouette lit, or it's called the rim light effect in the terms. And yeah, it is interesting to see one of them in action. Spoke about ISO. I want to pause here and give you guys an analogy over here, which I heard from one of my mentors, basically. So somebody looked at his photo and they said, "Wow, what an amazing photograph! You must have the best camera in the world." But the thing that kind of came back is, just because you baked a very good cake, would you give the oven all the credit? Right? So that is the analogy I want to bring here, saying that just having the good equipment and good composition does not mean that your recipe for a good photograph is done. It is basically you need to do much more than that. So post-processing is a very, very important aspect of photography. There are free softwares like GIMP that's available. There is Adobe Lightroom Classic, which is a paid version. I personally prefer the Adobe Lightroom Classic because it gives you much more control over what you need to do with your post-processing. Basically, once you are done with taking your photograph, you can actually not manipulate it to an extent where it becomes very unnatural, but at the same time keeping it very close to what you would want it to be or what you really saw. Your eyes can capture much more than what your camera did. So you want to bring what you captured on your camera very close to what you actually saw, right? This image that we shot, again, was shot in a very bad light, and a lot of ISO, high ISO, and a lot of noise. But we use the post-processing to reduce the noise and play around a little bit with brightness and contrast and basic color adjustments. That's all we did, and made the image look much sharper and much better, close to it. The only piece of advice which I strongly recommend to everyone who's doing post-processing is please trust your eyes, because you're the one who saw that moment and you're the one who captured that moment. You know exactly when to stop increasing the color or decreasing the brightness or whatever values you're changing in your post-processing. You are the closest, that you're the only person who really knows how you saw it. So trust your eyes and make the changes on those post-processing basics that I mentioned over there. This is one of the things that I wanted to showcase why it is important to do post-processing. And at the same time, I'm also going to talk about file format. This is the image that I captured in behind the well on the amphitheater or the football ground, right? So it was a very bad light. I captured this image. I liked it because the Drongo, Ashley Drongo just gotten itself its meal in a week. I could have discarded this image and said, you know what, this doesn't make sense. But if I could have the patience of playing around with a little bit of settings on the post-processing, this is what it turned out to be. And I didn't do anything unnatural over here. I did not add elements, I did not Photoshop it, I did not do anything else. I just played around with the basic settings that I spoke about in the beginning: brightness, contrast, color adjustments. That's all we did, and we could actually get the whole details out of this image, right? And one of the things I want to emphasize here is the file format, what you're shooting. Always try to shoot in RAW. If I had shot this image in JPEG, I would have not had the chance to process it and get the clarity out of it. It is very important to shoot in RAW, because RAW is where you get all the data that you capture through the camera as is, and then you get to play around with it a lot more details in post-processing. Whereas in JPEG, you do not have that many options to play around with. Once you shoot in JPEG, the options that you have for post-processing is very limited. So it's highly recommended to shoot in RAW.
That is, if I'm someone who doesn't like, I'm not interested at all in post-processing. I just want to display my images as I took them. I only like clicking photographs. I don't like playing around with them afterwards. Does it still make sense to shoot RAW?
No, it doesn't make sense to shoot in RAW. Like for example, what will happen, that's the difference I wanted to bring out over here, is that if you're a person who would like to shoot only in JPEG, and you just want to use them for whatever purposes, and you do not want to invest your time in manipulating it a little bit here and there, then you wouldn't have probably used this image at all. You would have shot this image, you wouldn't have used it, and you would have said, okay, this doesn't make sense, it doesn't look good to me, I'll just discard this image and move on to the next one.
I have a different opinion about it. See, what happens is, today you might not be interested, but 2 years down the line, when you want to actually do it, you would miss it. So if you really think that you don't have the patience to do it, shoot both. I mean, most of the cameras have the option of shooting both in RAW and
Exactly, I was going to go
keep a RAW file, because you'll never be able to get that moment again. So if you think that you don't want to process, but you just want to use that image, that's what a lot of photographers do. If, for example, the one which goes to the press and all, they always shoot with both of these, so that the JPEG is immediately used, and for posterity, and when you wanted to use it for a longer time, you always have the RAW file with you.
That is one reason, and also if option for you would be to shoot both, as you said, in RAW and JPEG, wherein you can immediately use the JPEG if you like it for whatever purposes you want. Like some people use it for your social media, Instagram and stuff like that, and then keep the RAW file so that when you really like it and you want to print it, and you want a high resolution or a big size print or whatever, you would absolutely need the RAW for you to enhance it in such a way that you can actually get a large format print. So if you do not like it, recommendation is stick with both. Your camera options will give you to shoot in both or just one of them. So you can pick both.
So these are options available in the digital camera?
Yes. Yes. You have an option to shoot only in JPEG, only in RAW, or both.
I feel like it may not be very clear. RAW is clearly the superior format.
Yes.
So why would anyone shoot in JPEG, period? I don't know. I understand. I don't particularly know that it's clear. What are the disadvantages to shooting in RAW?
Yeah, Jeet was saying something.
So basically this is again something that we inherited from the past, when we didn't have enough space and the file sizes were becoming big. So again, a group of people from all over the world came together and said, we'll create a format which is compressed. So that is how the JPEG format came into being. So now the new JPEG, which is going to be, it's supposed to have come this year, but unfortunately because of COVID it didn't come. The new JPEG format will be as good as RAW. And they are working on a new format. So basically now computers have become much better, and we can hold much better data, and we are able to process data much faster. So they are working on a JPEG which will be equivalent to RAW. So there's the only difference between a RAW file and a JPEG file is that one is compressed, and many of the information that is there in the RAW file is taken out.
It's more than compressed, Jeet. The one thing I want to bring clarity over here, it's more than compressed. You also can play around with the settings to get the JPEG.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
for
so
example, in your
depending on
camera,
the
it
information
will tell you
is
if you're
lost.
shooting in JPEG, you can do some adjustments, make some color adjustment, make something else look good. You have those final adjustments on this. So it will give you a ready product for you to use. It's like an instant gratification, right? You shoot something with basic settings that is already there on a JPEG and you can use it. Whereas RAW is all hard work. You need to shoot in a RAW, bring it out, then put in some efforts to change it. But the hard work is worth it because you have more data to play around with in a RAW file than a JPEG file, which has got very less information in it in the smaller file. And as Jeet mentioned, yes, probably the whole format of JPEG is going to evolve and move on. But always having those two. The reason why I'm also stressing on having both RAW and JPEG together is these days the storage is affordable. It's becoming more and more affordable. You get 64 gigs that are better speeds for like 4,000 rupees SD card. And then everybody has access to laptops and other things. You don't need to worry about storage much. Yes, it's a little bit of pain for managing it, but when it comes to storage, it's pretty accessible. You can shoot it, bring it, put it on your laptop, and then keep the ones that you want, delete the other ones that you don't want, but you can keep both formats. Use JPEG for immediate use, like you want to email somebody or send somebody on through WhatsApp, and then use the RAW for processing it.
Actually, an interesting fact is RAW files are actually allowed as a proof of in the code, whereas JPEGs are not, because JPEG can. So RAW files actually can be used in the court of law as a proof, as evidence.
And the last thing that I want to mention on the file format why RAW is very important is that if you started your journey into the wildlife photography now and say in the next couple of years you've gotten better at it, and then you want to start entering into wildlife photography contests. When you go into wildlife photography contests and you send them a JPEG, they will always ask for a RAW. Because they will, each and every contest will have their own rules and regulations that they'll say you cannot crop beyond this size, you cannot do so much adjustment. They'll have a set of rules. And then when you send your entry as the JPEG format, they will always ask for a RAW so that they can compare it and say, okay, this RAW belongs to you, and yes, you have adhered to all the rules and regulations before you've submitted your entry. That is also very important. And I'm not saying that should be your only goal, but eventually, why not? Why not that over a period of time, you take enough photos and you've been in the wild so good and you capture some good moments, why not send it to some contests and entries and
so just add, when you actually shoot in both formats, because RAW captures a lot more detail, the clarity itself is better. Even without processing, if you compare the two images, the RAW actually has more clarity than JPEG. So that's
JPEG is also another thing that wherein your camera decides. There is.
The JPEG is processed in the camera.
Yeah, so the camera decides how to process the JPEG and show it to you, whereas in RAW you can be more creative.
Can you convert the RAW form into JPEG?
Yes.
After you put
Yeah, in those post-processing tools that I just mentioned, in the free ones, the GIMP you can use. So you basically get the RAW file, do your changes, you do your basic adjustments, whatever you feel like, and then you export it as JPEG and use it. Or you can export it as a TIFF if you want to print it. So there are multiple options that you have, and you can use
Does
it.
that hamper the quality or the
No. So basically,
Just come as
yeah.
is.
So you've taken a RAW file and then exported it, so it's as close to the original as. There will be impact on what you want to use the JPEG for. Like for example, if you take a RAW file and process it and export it as a JPEG and then go use it on Instagram, Instagram has their own version, their own controls, wherein they will reduce the quality further. right? Like for example, you take the shot and you assume this JPEG file is about 4 MB size and whatever is the clarity and depth, right? Instagram doesn't allow you to upload for more than 2 MB of a file, or they have some restrictions. I don't know the exact details. So they will manipulate your image further. So to avoid that, you have options in these post-processing tools where you can export it to the formats or the controls that these social sites put, and that way they don't, degrade your quality of the image further.
In this picture, what's happened in the background?
That's a kite. It was an overcast kite.
Okay.
It's a twig of the tree, and the background is an overcast sky.
Post-processing software that you mentioned, are they usually better than the software that comes along with the camera itself for the post-processing?
I wouldn't say yes or no to that question, because each software that comes, like for example, the software that came with your camera could be as good as the GIMP, the freeware that's available, or it could be better, right? You can start using the software that you get with your camera first, but then over a period of time you will start feeling as you try it out and as you play around with it, you'll start seeing the difference. The reason I love Adobe Lightroom Adobe Lightroom Classic is they have a dedicated R&D team that goes out and tests each and every lens available in the market, regardless of make. And this is probably getting too technical. I hadn't planned for it, but I'll just take a minute and explain this. Each and every lens available in the market, they go out, they try it out, and figure out what are the defects in those lenses. And Lightroom has a package wherein the moment you bring in your photo and you can say do lens correction, you just click a checkbox that says lens correction. It will automatically tell you this photo was shot on a Sony or a Canon or a 100-400 lens or a 600 prime lens or whatever it is, and it will do a lot of corrections in terms of chromatic aberrations and lens correction. And it's a very wide subject. There are a lot of things that you don't notice probably when you just look at your photo, but when you do the lens correction, you'll see the image change, right? So those are some of the examples of features that you'll start seeing missing in either the out-of-the-box the software that you got in your camera or the freeware in GIMP, and I'm not saying one is the better over the other, but as you start playing around with post-processing, you will start experiencing different features and you will start wanting to do something more with your photos. It's like a journey. You start with the out-of-the-box software with your camera, then you probably go on to GIMP or some other free. There are a lot of free tools available. There are a lot of paid tools available also on the internet. But it depends on you saying, okay, now I've done this, what next? If you keep feeding your curiosity, you'll probably start experimenting more. Do I have anything else? The last slide, basically accessories and care. Now that you have your equipment, try looking for different accessories that you can use. Tripod, the tripod head, monoboard. Teleconverter is something that I personally find it very helpful. It is basically to get the reach to the subject. If your lens is not enough, the 600 mm focal point is not enough, I use a teleconverter which will give me 1.4x times what I'm seeing. The downside of using a teleconverter is that you lose out on the light. It's the more you put accessories in between the lens and the camera and the sensor, the lesser the light that falls on the sensor. If you're okay and it is a very well lit, bright day and you still need that reach, I would recommend getting a teleconverter for your cameras. Binoculars, and there are a lot more accessories available. Lens cleaning kit is also something that I would recommend. You need to take care of your equipment now that you have it. Keep it shiny for the next use. Over to you. Thanks. Thank you.
So, I thought I'll cover a few more aspects of it. I mean, one of the important things is the ethics in wildlife photography. This cartoon actually covers it very thing where a lot of people try to go after unethical means to actually shoot photographs and things like that. So one is show respect for wildlife. Like I started off saying, you need to respect wildlife. I mean, we are out there in their surroundings trying to do it as a hobby, but at the end of the day you are harming their life, or you could be interrupting their life. So just show respect for it. Follow rules and regulations. I've seen a lot of people actually break rules in the forest or even in the natural surroundings to get some good photographs. People climb up trees, people climb up, they do a lot of things actually. So I really say follow the rules and regulations. One of the most important things which I really hate is luring animals and birds by using calls. I hate that. Please don't do that ever. I mean, that's a really unethical thing to do. Do not feed animals or use it as a bait to get photographs. I mean, I've seen a lot of photographers try to do that, but it's not worth it. Do not crowd. I mean, this happens a lot when you are in some of these big forests like Kabini and where you see crowding the things. I mean, there have been days where we have walked away because we were almost on the point of harassing the animal. Do not crowd. Try to be give respect to the animals. I mean, end of the day, that's what you want to do, right? I mean, you love wildlife. That's why you're doing wildlife photography. Do not try to do nest photography by going too close. I know everybody loves photography. I mean, we've seen a lot of photographs even in the Wild Malar group as well. And just be careful. I mean, I personally don't like doing it. So I advise people not to do it. Or if you want to do it, just try to be a little far away and respect it. I mean, end of the day, they're starting a family, because I've seen birds abandoning their nest when you're trying, because of what you're doing, or because they fear that there's something happening. It could also be that you have a lot of feral dogs and cats, and they follow what you're doing, and they might actually go attack the nest. So it's very important that you stay far away from the nest. Do not chase the animals or birds. I mean, this is a very big thing, particularly in cities like Bangalore, where people, I don't know if you know about it, but there's a lake called Hisarghetta Lake, and at one point of time you could see 50, 100 cars running behind birds on that place. Or even in the wildlife sanctuaries, I mean, the way you see them crowded and things like that. Do not chase them, harass them. So a few things which I wanted to bring out. One of the important aspects is how you dress when you do wildlife photography. I mean, try avoiding bright colors. Use camouflage, browns, grays. Thing. One of the things is be careful and aware of your surroundings. I mean, when you're photographing, you don't know what's happening. Sometimes now it helps. I mean, I've always believed in going with people to do wildlife photography, because somebody else is also there with you. Because a lot of the places in and around Bangalore, if you're alone, you could get mugged. So be careful. I mean, a lot of places. I mean, places like Valley School, Turahalli, and we stopped going there unless we were in a group, because we heard a lot of incidents being reported of people mugging and things like that. So just be a little careful, or try to grow in groups. Don't try to go alone and things like that. Unless, I wouldn't say go in a group to Dodbelegre, because we know it's safe. But if you're going to say Turahalli, for example, you want to be a little careful and things like that. And also, it's also about what you're doing, right? When you're in that moment, you forget that you could actually fall down into something else, or there is something else behind you, and you need to be just careful. Maintain silence, important aspect of wildlife photography. I mean, this is something which doesn't come naturally if you're not into wildlife photography. I mean, a lot of times when you go on the safaris, right, you literally have to shout at people to remain silent, because they keep chatting inside the safaris, or when you go birding and things like that. So that's an important aspect. Avoid strong odors, perfumes when you go on wildlife photography. I mean, I don't know how many of you know there is a Calvin Klein perfume called Obsession. I love it, by the way, but there is a rumor that if you wear it, actually cats are actually attracted to it. So but don't try all of those things. I mean, try avoiding all of those things. And then, like I started off by saying, right, I mean, what I call as the charismatic megafauna, right? I mean, your elephants, tigers, leopards are not the only thing. There are a lot of things around. I mean, you have spiders, you have what you call the insects, you have snakes. There's so much to shoot. I mean, don't just run behind those things. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I mean, I do that as well. I mean, I go to Kabini a lot in my wildlife things, but there are other things to do as well. So you need to do everything. I mean, because end of the day, if you just run behind those things, how much tigers can you shoot? End of the day, I mean, you need to do more things in wildlife to really enjoy wildlife photography. Some support resources. I mean, one of the major ones which I use is the BNG Birds, where I get a lot of understanding about what's happening. The others are there. I mean, we'll circulate the list. But one of the best things that happened was the Malar Wildlife Group, where we learned so much. I mean, even now, I mean, after being in the doing wildlife photography for 12 years, I learned so much. I mean, and it's not just from people like Chayant who are so passionate about it. It's also from a lot of other people actually. I mean, there are people like Tejas, who's a young kid and he's so interested in wildlife photography. So you learn from so many. I mean, every time you are in the group, you keep learning new things. You learn it from a lot of new people. Follow people on Twitter. My timeline is filled with people who do wildlife photography and nature and things like that. So Malhar Wildlife Group is something, if you are not part of, I would advise all of you to be part of. I mean, it's an amazing place to be actually. Any questions?